Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today I got a very fun, very exciting, and very history-filled episode for you guys today, because I'm going to be telling you the entire story about how the Nintendo GameCube was almost made by the 3DO company as the 3DO M3. And I swear the engineers at the 3DO company that became Cagent with Samsung were some of the most unlucky people in the video game market, because they developed so many different to-completion home consoles that almost saw the light of day but were cancelled at the last second. And this is going to be such a fun story. I've done a ton of research and I've got a lot of first-hand accounts from the engineers that worked on the project, and this got so incredibly close you almost played GameCube games on 3DO hardware, and I'm pretty sure 99 out of 100 of you didn't know about that, but if you did, leave me a comment down below. And I will say the GameCube is probably my favorite Nintendo console of all time as far as the hardware is concerned, as well as the library on it. This was not a hugely successful console for Nintendo, but it has some of my favorite games of all time running on the hardware. But I'm here to tell you they could have had better hardware a year earlier and gotten to the market so much in a better position, because honestly it wouldn't play 3DO M2 games, but it would have played 3DO M3 games, which is the hardware underlying what we're going to be talking about today. And I just felt like trying to put a Battletrist disc into a GameCube. Obviously it doesn't work. And when we talk about the 3DO M2, it was a design that was completed and shipped for arcade boards and kiosk uses for business environments. But the engineers were always working on new chipsets, and they had MX and S43. The acronyms can get a little bit confusing, but I will definitely break them down for you. The 3DO M3 was what it was called first. Sometimes they used the MX acronym, but it ended up being what we would call S42. That was the design that was after the 3DO M2 that the engineers had fully developed and had working hardware for. This was going to ship in the year 2000, about 18 months before the GameCube would ever hit the actual market. And there's so much empirical data and evidence to support this. This is Game Informer right here, and they're talking about the fact that apparently 3DO and Nintendo are talking about the next system, and they're using the acronym MX, which is something that Panasonic would go on to use when they described the 3DO M2 with a DVD drive and a double complement of RAM. But if we take a look again at the GameCube, it's such an interesting story. The 3DO M2 obviously exists, we have hardware and I've shown it to you, and it runs off a DVD-ROM and PowerPC processors along with the Bulldog ASIC. What MX in the first iteration, or S42 as it finally became known, was a PowerPC based console running off DVD-ROM and having a much more powerful ASIC that would have had all of the parts combined on one die, including RAM access to allow for very fast transfers of data, being able to run the GPU at the same clock speed as what the CPU would have run as. It was a very concise, very compact design that was absolutely powerful. And again, as we go through the data, I'm going to back up each and every one of these points so you know exactly what Nintendo was planning on doing here. And again, I've talked to all the engineers involved in this project privately just to confirm some information as well. So basically Nintendo was in negotiation with Samsung and Cagent. When the 3DO company closed, the M2 design was purchased by Panasonic as a home console that never came, and the engineering team was purchased by Samsung and spun off into Cagent. So these are the companies we're talking about, and these are the engineers that developed the 3DO M2 platform, Konami being one of the licensees, but Panasonic, Matsushita owning the full rights to the M2, but they never actually took the team with them. They bought the final console design, and all of the engineering staff got moved over to Samsung, and they were called Cagent. They were the developers of the Bulldog ASIC, and they had a completed system ready to ship so long as they could find a buyer, because Samsung was not in any way, shape, or form interested in the home console space. And basically this is what Nintendo was going to buy. There was a little bit of weirdness because Nintendo wanted a MIP system, not a PowerPC system, but we'll get into that in just a bit. But again, the acronyms are MX and S42. You're going to be seeing MX a lot more, but again, Panasonic used that for the M2, so it gets a little shaky. That's why I'm giving you both acronyms at the same time. So as we move over here, you'll see that Nintendo executives had visited Cagent Cagent, however you want to pronounce it, and they were basically in the home stretch of purchasing the entire company. They just didn't have a PowerPC development license. They had a MIPS development license, obviously from the Nintendo 64. So this was something where the Cagent engineers that developed the M2 were trying to reconfigure the system to run on a different processor. Because remember, again, the MIPS instruction set is going to be different than the PowerPC instruction set, and while this can be done, it does take a little bit of time, and it seems like at least at the beginning, Nintendo was very married to the idea of continuing using a MIPS CPU, probably because that's what they were comfortable with through the entire Nintendo 64 development process, but that is going to change in just a bit. But basically, this just fell through. For some reason, even though Samsung was asking for a not large purchase price, Nintendo never ended up buying Cagent. It actually ended up going to Microsoft, where it became the Web TV division. And obviously, that is tying into the original Xbox. So there's going to be another part of this series, how the original Xbox was almost 3DO hardware. If you can't tell the trend and thread that goes through all of this already, the 3DO engineers that made the original console, M2, MX, and S42, had so much trouble actually shipping hardware. They were amazing chip developers, but when it came down to actually doing the business deals with different companies to get this hardware in the home market space, that seems to be where their string of bad luck just continued over and over and over again. Tons of silicon designed by this team, but so few bits of it actually shipped out into the world. And interestingly enough, with all the technologies they owned, it was basically a finished console, and the engineers here mention, I have talked to them, they have talked about their time developing this hardware, and it was ready to go. It could have been put into production, and development kits could have been out to partners within 2 to 3 months of actually signing the contract. And I've talked to the engineers listed here as well, and it was just 100% good to go. This team is the definition of always a bridesmaid, never a bride. Even SGI considered buying them at one point in time to offer back what Nintendo was interested in, but walked away. And there really isn't any reason for Nintendo walking away, but you know historically Nintendo is a very flaky company. But it is amazing how many different pieces of hardware were almost based on 3DO technology. I've already shown you guys the Dreamcast video. If you missed that, I will leave a link in the description below. But Sega almost bought the 3DO M2 to make a console after the Sega Saturn, but that fell through. Then Nintendo almost buys the next iteration of 3DO hardware, but that falls through at the last second as well. So right now you have the original 3DO and then M2 and S42 not existing on the home market whatsoever. So the 3DO company has only shipped one of the 3 console designs that was finished and ready to go. And in hardware development, those are not good odds, even though the hardware was absolutely awesome. And they talk about, again, the fact that this was ready to ship in 2000, but Nintendo went over to RX, and obviously they didn't have a system ready to ship. Sure, they had some hardware, but they had to help develop it, and that's why they talk about Christmas 2000 when we realized that GameCube came out at the end of 2001. So Nintendo could have had a 3DO design console ready to go under the Christmas tree in the year 2000, or really anywhere when they wanted to launch it. And that is just such an interesting tidbit of historical information. And it's not like this hardware was any weaker than what you would have had with the GameCube. It starts off being something, when they talk about MX, being like a 5 million polygon per second with all effects turned on, and obviously Nintendo wanted MIPS, not PowerPC, so maybe that was something that kept them from wanting to acquire Cagent and the 3DO M3 design. But if you don't realize, what happened was the GameCube went over to PowerPC anyway. It left MIPS, went over to an IBM architecture, so all of that concern about changing the processor was for naught, because you end up with PowerPC. And again, the stated draw rate of something like a GameCube with all effects turned on is 6 to 20 million polygons per second. Talking to the engineers, going over the data sheets that I have seen, the 3DO M3, S42, whatever you want to call it, could get up to 20 million polygons per second with all effects turned on. So it would have been as graphically impressive as the GameCube. It would have been out a year earlier. It would have been able to more compete with PlayStation 2 based on that that launch period of time, and the entire trajectory of Nintendo's GameCube may have been completely changed, not just on the hardware front, but also on the success in the market, having basically what would have been a 12-month head start on the actual GameCube that you ended up playing, and that would have been a really interesting alternative history had it happened. But that, in a nutshell, is the story of the 3DO M3, S42, or MX, whatever you want to call it. Nintendo got to the 11th hour of purchasing the entire engineering team behind the project, as well as the project that was ready to ship to consumers basically then. This was not a paper design. This was not something that was on a gigantic table as a large hand-built prototype. It was basically just ready to be put into a shell and cleaned up for release. Obviously that didn't happen, but we still have 2 more stories to tell about 3DO hardware because one of the consoles actually came out, but you'll have to wait for that video. Bye-bye.